The dust cloud rose like a prayer toward the Montana sky, thick and red against the morning sun. Cassidy Hayes pulled her father's old hat lower over her eyes and squinted through the haze at the sprawling ranch ahead. The Triple Crown spread out before her like a promise she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her mare copper shifted beneath her, sensing the tension that had been coiled tight in Cassidy's shoulders for the past 3 days of riding. The leather reins felt slippery in her palms, not from sweat, but from the wear of too many miles and too many rejections. "This is it, girl," she whispered to the horse, her voice barely audible over the wind that swept down from the Rockies. "Last chance." The letter in her saddlebag had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases had worn soft as cloth. Help wanted. Experienced ranch hand. Good wages. No questions asked. That last line had caught her attention 3 weeks ago, when she'd seen it posted outside Murphy's General Store in Billings. No questions asked usually meant they were desperate. Desperate was exactly what she needed. The ranch house sat at the heart of the valley, like a fortress built from timber and stone, surrounded by corrals that stretched in every direction. Cattle dotted the pastures beyond, black shapes moving slow and steady across grass that rolled green and endless toward the mountain line. Smoke curled from the chimney of what looked like a bunkhouse off to the east, and the rhythmic sound of hammering echoed from somewhere near the barn. Cassidy had seen plenty of spreads in her 24 years, but nothing quite like this. The Triple Crown wasn't just big, it was organized. Every fence post stood straight and true. Every gate hung level. The barn doors weren't just functional, they were painted and maintained. This was a place where details mattered, where someone cared enough to do things right. She'd learned to read ranches the way other folks read books. The way the horses held their heads told you about the treatment they received. The condition of the tack spoke to the owner's priorities. The state of the water troughs revealed whether this was a place that understood that small things mattered as much as big ones. Everything she could see told her the same story. Whoever ran the Triple Crown knew what they were doing. The problem was, she'd been hearing stories about the owner for the better part of 2 years. Jackson Murphy, no relation to the store owner in Billings, had a reputation that stretched from the Canadian border down to Wyoming. Tough as boot leather, fair but demanding, and absolutely, categorically opposed to hiring women for ranch work. She'd heard the phrase a dozen times in as many towns. "Murphy won't hire a cowgirl. Says they're more trouble than they're worth." The variations were endless, but the message was always the same. Women belonged in kitchens or schoolhouses, not on horseback with a rope in their hands. Cassidy had built her life proving that kind of thinking wrong. Her father, Samuel Hayes, had owned a small spread outside of Great Falls before the drought of '89 took everything they had. She'd been 16 then, already able to rope and ride better than most of the men he'd hired over the years. Samuel had taught her that cattle didn't care if you wore a dress or trousers. They responded to confidence and competence. Horses didn't judge you by the pitch of your voice. They listened to the steadiness of your hands and the clarity of your intentions. When the bank took their land, Samuel had done what he could to find work, but age and a bad back had made him unreliable for the kind of labor ranches demanded. He died 2 years later in a boarding house in Helena, leaving Cassidy with nothing but copper, her father's saddle, and a skill set that half the territory refused to acknowledge. She'd spent the time since moving from ranch to ranch, town to town, taking whatever work she could find. She'd mucked stalls for $1 a week. She'd broken horses for men who paid her half what they'd pay a man for the same job. She'd cooked for cattle drives and mended fences and birthed calves in the middle of blizzards, always proving herself, always fighting for the chance to show what she could do. But the work was getting harder to find. Word traveled fast in ranch country. and not all of it was good. Some men didn't like being shown up by a woman, even when she did the job better than they could. Others saw a single woman as a distraction or a complication they didn't want to deal with. Still others simply couldn't get past the idea that ranch work was man's work, no matter how well she did it. The money she'd saved from her last job, 3 months breaking horses for a spread near Missoula, was nearly gone. She had enough left for maybe a week in a boarding house, 2 if she was careful about meals. After that, she'd be looking at choices she didn't want to make, which brought her here to the Triple Crown. Staring at a ranch that looked like everything she'd ever wanted to be part of, and wondering if the stories about Jackson Murphy were true, Copper took a step forward without being asked, as if she understood that standing still wasn't going to solve anything. Cassidy led her, guiding the mare down the slope toward the main buildings. The closer they got, the more impressive the operation became. The corrals weren't just well maintained. They were intelligently designed, with gates that allowed cattle to flow efficiently from one area to another. The water systems were gravity-fed from a creek that had been carefully diverted to serve the entire ranch. Even the placement of the buildings showed thought, close enough together for efficiency, far enough apart to prevent the spread of fire. This was the work of someone who understood ranching, not just as a business, but as a craft. A man emerged from the barn as she approached, wiping his hands on a rag that had once been white. He was tall and lean, with the kind of build that came from years of physical work. His hat was pushed back on his head, revealing dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of winter sky. He wore his clothes like he'd been born in them, faded denims and a work shirt that had been mended more than once but still looked clean. This would be Jackson Murphy. She'd never seen him before, but she recognized the way he carried himself. This was a man who owned everything he could see and took that responsibility seriously. He stopped when he spotted her, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to something harder to read. His gaze took in everything: her horse, her saddle, the way she sat, the rifle strapped to her gear. Professional assessment. She'd seen it 100 times before. "You lost?" His voice carried easily across the distance between them, though. He made no move to come closer. "Not if this is the Triple Crown," she called back. "I'm here about the job." Something changed in his posture. Not quite tension, but a settling, like a man bracing for something he'd dealt with before. "That so?" Cassidy guided Copper closer, close enough that they wouldn't have to shout. "Saw your notice in Billings. Said you needed experienced help." Jackson Murphy looked her over again, more slowly this time. She could see him taking inventory, her boots, worn but well-maintained, her hat, shaped by weather and use, the rope coiled neat and ready at her saddle horn. The assessment wasn't personal, exactly, but it wasn't entirely professional either. "Notice also said no questions asked," she added when he didn't respond immediately. "That it did." He stepped closer to her horse, reaching out to let Copper sniff his hand before stroking her neck. The mare responded immediately, relaxing under his touch. "Nice horse. You train her yourself?" "My father started her. I finished the job." Samuel Hayes's daughter. It wasn't a question. Cassidy felt something cold settle in her stomach. If he knew who she was, he'd heard the stories. Some of them might even be true. "Yes, sir." Jackson nodded once, his hand still on Copper's neck. "Heard about Sam. Good man. Sorry for your loss." "Thank you. Also heard you can handle yourself with a rope." "I can handle myself with most things, given the chance." That earned her something that might have been a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "What are you looking for? A chance?" "I'm looking for work, Mr. Murphy. Good, honest work for good, honest pay. Same as any man would be." Any man wouldn't have to ride 100 miles just to find someone willing to consider hiring him. The words hung in the air between them. He knew, of course he knew. In a territory where news traveled faster than horses, where every ranch hand who got fired or quit became a story told around bunkhouse stoves. Everyone knew about the woman who could rope and ride, but couldn't find steady work. "No, sir," she said quietly. "I don't suppose he would." Jackson stepped back from her horse, and for a moment she thought that was it. Another door closing, another road leading nowhere. She was already calculating distances in her head, how far to the next town, how much money she had left, whether Copper could make another long ride on short rations. "You ever work cattle in a rough country?" he asked suddenly. "Yes, sir." "Worked." "A drive through the Birdtooth Pass 2 years back. Lost only 3 head in 5 weeks. That's good work. It was a good crew." "You ever deal with problem horses? Ones that other folks have given up on?" Cassidy felt something shift inside her chest, something that might have been hope, more than I care to count. "You know anything about doctoring cattle? Treating injuries, handling difficult births?" "Some. Enough to be useful, not enough to be dangerous." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jackson was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those winter blue eyes. She could hear the sound of work continuing around them, the ring of hammer on metal, the lowing of cattle in the distance, voices calling back and forth between the corrals, normal ranch sounds, the sounds of a place where people knew what they were doing and did it well. "I'll be straight with you, Miss Hayes," he said finally. "I've never hired a woman for ranch work. Not because I think women can't do the job, but because it complicates things. Men act different when there's a woman around. They either try to show off or they try to protect, and both of those things can get people hurt when you're dealing with 1,500-pound animals and rough country." Cassidy had heard variations of this speech before. Usually it ended with, "So I'm sure you understand why I can't take the risk." She waited for the rest of it. "On the other hand," Jackson continued, "I'm short 3 men and winter's coming fast. I've got cattle scattered across 10,000 acres, and some of them are in places that'll be impossible to reach once the snow starts. I've got horses that need training and fences that need mending and a dozen other jobs that can't wait for me to find the perfect crew." He paused, looking out across his ranch as if seeing all the work that needed doing. "I also know that Sam Hayes taught his daughter everything he knew about ranching, and Sam Hayes was one of the best I ever met. So here's what I'm thinking. You work for me for 2 weeks. Trial period. You do the job without causing problems, you get the job permanent. You cause problems or can't handle the work, you move on with no hard feelings and 2 weeks' wages." Cassidy felt her heart start to beat faster. "What kind of problems are you worried about exactly?" "The kind that come from men forgetting that work comes first. The kind that come from someone thinking they need special treatment because they're different. The kind that come from folks not being able to take orders or not being willing to pull their weight. I've never asked for special treatment in my life, Mr. Murphy, and I've never met a job I couldn't handle if someone was willing to give me the chance to try." "That's what I'm hoping to hear." Jackson extended his hand toward her. 2 weeks. We'll see how it goes." Cassidy leaned down from her saddle to shake his hand. His grip was firm and calloused, the handshake of a man who'd built everything he owned with his own hands. 2 weeks, she agreed. "Bunkhouse is over there, Jackson." Sud, pointing toward the building she'd noticed earlier. "You'll be sharing with 4 other hands. They're good men, but they're going to test you. That's just the way it is. You prove yourself to them, you'll have allies for life. You don't, and the next 2 weeks are going to be miserable. I understand. Suppers. At 6, work starts at dawn. You'll want to get settled and introduce yourself before then." Jackson started to turn away, then stopped. "One more thing, Miss Hayes. I meant what I said about no special treatment. You'll do the same work as everyone else, in the same conditions, for the same expectations. If you can't keep up, I'll send you on your way without a second thought. I wouldn't expect anything else. Good. This time the smile did reach his eyes, though only barely. Welcome to the Triple Crown. As Jackson walked back toward the barn, Cassidy sat in her saddle for a moment, letting the reality of it sink in. 2 weeks. It wasn't the permanent position she'd been hoping for, but it was more than she'd had that morning. More than she'd had in months, really. She guided Copper toward the bunkhouse, noting the way the other buildings were arranged around it. The cook shack was close enough that the hands wouldn't have to walk far in bad weather. The tack room was positioned so that gear could be accessed easily from both the bunkhouse and the corrals. Even the privies were placed with thought for both convenience and privacy. This was a place where someone had considered what it would be like to live here, not just work here. The bunkhouse door was propped open to catch the afternoon breeze. Cassidy could hear voices inside, the kind of easy conversation that came from men who'd worked together long enough to develop their own rhythms and routines. She tied Copper to the hitching rail outside and pulled her saddlebags from behind. The cantle, everything she owned in the world fit in those bags, and the bedroll tied behind her saddle. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and it had gotten her this far. She paused at the threshold, suddenly aware that she was about to walk into a world that might not want her. In her experience, ranch hands fell into 2 categories when it came to women: those who thought she was there for their entertainment, and those who thought she was there to cause trouble. Neither group was particularly welcoming, but she'd learned a long time ago that hesitation didn't solve problems. She stepped through the door. The bunkhouse was larger than she'd expected, with 8 bunks arranged along the walls and a pot-bellied stove in the center. 4 men sat around a wooden table near the window, playing cards and talking in low voices. They looked up when she entered, their conversation dying abruptly. For a moment, nobody moved. Cassidy stood just inside the door, her saddlebags over her shoulder, meeting their stares with what she hoped was calm confidence. She'd learned that the first few seconds usually determined how these encounters would go. The oldest of the 4, a man with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life outdoors, was the first to speak. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, but not unkindly. "The boss actually hired a woman. Trial period," Cassidy said. 2 weeks. 2 weeks, huh? This from a younger man with sandy hair and the kind of smile that suggested he thought the whole situation was amusing. That ought to be interesting. The 3rd man, dark-haired and serious-looking, just nodded at her. The 4th, barely more than a boy really, stared at her like she was some kind of exotic animal he'd never seen before. "I'm Cassidy Hayes," she said. Because someone had to break the silence, the older man stood up, extending his hand. "Tom Patterson. Been ramrodding this outfit for going on 8 years. These are my boys, Pete Marshall, Carlos Santos, and the kid there is Billy Thompson." Pete and Carlos nodded their acknowledgement. Billy continued to stare. "You can take that bunk over there," Tom said, pointing to an empty bed near the far wall. "It's got the best light for reading, if you're inclined that way. Also the farthest from Billy, who snores like a freight train." "I do not," Billy protested, finding his voice at last. "Son, you could wake the dead," Pete said with a grin. "We've been talking about tying you to a tree outside. See if the coyotes will claim you." The easy banter seemed to loosen something in the atmosphere. Cassidy moved to the indicated bunk and set her bags down, noting that it was indeed positioned to catch the afternoon light from the window. She wondered if Tom had chosen it for that reason or if it was just coincidence. "What's your background?" Carlos asked. His voice carried a slight accent that suggested he'd been born somewhere south of the border, but his English was perfect. "Grew up on a spread near Great Falls. Been working ranches since I was old enough to stay in a saddle." "Your daddy teach you?" "Everything he knew." Tom nodded approvingly. Sam Hayes was a good people. "Heard about what happened to his place. Drought's a hard thing." "Yes, sir, it is." "You've been working since then?" when I can find it." The men exchanged glances. They knew, or could guess, why finding work had been difficult for her. In their world, a woman looking for ranch work was unusual enough to be noteworthy. "What kind of work have you done?" Pete asked. "Little bit of everything. Cattle drives, horse breaking, fence work, haying, whatever needed doing." "You any good?" "With a rope? Good enough." Billy leaned forward eagerly. "How good is good enough?" "Good enough to do the job," Tom chuckled. "She's not going to brag, boys. You'll find out soon enough whether she can back up her talk." "Speaking of which," Carlos said, "what did Murphy tell you about the work situation here?" "Said you were short 3 men and winter was coming." "That's about the size of it," Tom confirmed. "We've got cattle scattered from hell for breakfast, and some of them are in a country that's going to be impossible once the snow flies. We've been working short-handed for 2 months now." "What happened to the men who left?" "One got married, decided he wanted to try farming. One took a job with the railroad. The third—" Tom paused, choosing his words carefully. "The third had a disagreement with the boss about the way things should be done." "What kind of disagreement?" "The kind where a man thinks his ideas are better than his boss's, and his boss thinks different." Cassidy nodded. She'd seen that dynamic before. Ranching was the kind of work where strong personalities were common, and not all of them mached well with authority. "So what's the plan for the next 2 weeks?" she asked. "Tomorrow we start bringing in the high country cattle," Tom said. "It's rough work, steep terrain, ornery animals, weather that can change faster than you can blink. After that, we've got fences to check and repair before winter, horses to train, and about a dozen other jobs that are all behind schedule." "Sounds like work." "It is that. Question is, can you handle it?" Cassidy met his gaze steadily. "Guess." "We'll find out," Pete laughed. "I like her. She doesn't make promises she might not be able to keep." "Smart approach," Carlos agreed. "Actions speak louder than words out here." Billy was still staring at her with undisguised curiosity. "You really grew up on a ranch?" "Born and raised." "What's it like, being a woman doing man's work?" The question was innocent enough, but Cassidy had learned to be careful with her answers. Say too much about the challenges, and men assumed you couldn't handle the job. Say too little, and they assumed you were naive about what you were getting into. "It's like being anyone doing any work," she said finally. "Some days are good, some days are hard, and most days you just do what needs doing." Tom stood up, stretching his back. "Supper's in about an hour. You'll want to wash up and settle in before then. Murphy likes his meals to start on time." "What's he like as a boss?" Cassidy asked. "Fair," Tom said without hesitation. "Demanding but fair. He'll work as hard as anyone, and he expects the same from his crew. He doesn't ask you to do anything he wouldn't do himself, and he doesn't tolerate slackers or troublemakers." "Does he pay well?" "Better than most. He figures good help is worth good wages, and he's right." Pete shuffled the cards absently. "Only thing is, he's got some particular ideas about how things should be done." "What kind of ideas?" "The right kind mostly," Carlos said. "But he doesn't explain himself much. He'll give you an order, and he expects you to follow it whether you understand the reasoning or not." "That a problem?" "Not if you're smart enough to trust that he knows what he's doing." "Which he does, mostly." Tom shot Pete a warning look. "What Pete's trying to say is that Murphy's methods aren't always conventional, but they work. He's built this place from nothing into one of the best ranches in the territory." "How long's he been here?" "Going on 12 years. Came out from the back east with more ambition than money, but he knew cattle and he wasn't afraid of work. Built it up slow and steady, always reinvesting instead of spending on fancy living." "He married?" The question seemed to hang in the air. Longer than it should have. The men exchanged glances again, and Cassidy realized she'd stumbled into something. "No," Tom said finally. "He's not married." Something in his tone suggested there was more to the story, but Cassidy didn't push. She'd learned that ranch hands would tell you what they thought you needed to know, when they thought you needed to know it, and not before. "Well," she said, standing up, "I better get cleaned up before supper. Don't want to start off on the wrong foot." She pulled a clean shirt from her saddlebags and headed for the door. Behind her, she could hear the men resuming their card game, their voices low and comfortable. It wasn't acceptance, exactly, but it wasn't hostility either. It was the kind of cautious neutrality that meant she'd have to prove herself, but at least they were willing to give her the chance to try. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to slant long across the valley. The mountains to the west were already casting purple shadows, and the air had the crisp edge that promised a cold night. Cassidy found the washstand behind the bunkhouse and splashed water on her face and hands, scrubbing away the dust of the trail dot as she dried herself with a towel that had seen better days. She caught sight of Jackson Murphy near the corrals, working with a young horse. Even from a distance, she could see the patience in his movements, the way he let the animal come to him instead of forcing the interaction. It was the mark of someone who understood that the best partnerships were built on trust rather than dominance. The horse was a beautiful bay gelding, probably 3 or 4 years old, with the kind of conformation that suggested speed and intelligence. As she watched, Jackson worked him through basic ground exercises, asking for respect and attention without demanding submission. It was skilled work, the kind that took years to master. Cassidy had always been drawn to horsemen who understood the subtleties of the relationship between human and animal. Her father had been that kind of trainer, and she'd inherited both his methods and his eye for quality. Watching Jackson work, she found herself reassessing her earlier impression of him. Man who could work with horses like that wasn't likely to be unfair to his human employees either. The dinner bell rang. Interrupting her thoughts, she gathered her things and headed toward the cook shack, where yellow light spilled from the windows and the smell of beef stew and fresh bread made her stomach remember that she hadn't eaten since dawn. This was it then. The beginning of 2 weeks that would determine whether she had a future at the Triple Crown or whether she'd be back on the trail, looking for the next opportunity in a world that didn't seem to have many of them for someone like her. But for the first time in months, she felt something that might have been optimism. Jackson Murphy might not have wanted to hire a woman, but he'd been willing to give her a chance. That was more than most men would have done, and it was all she'd ever really asked for, the chance to prove that she could do the job as well as anyone, regardless of what she wore, or how she sounded, or what other people thought about women in men's work. 2 weeks to show them all that. Cassidy Hayes was exactly what the Triple Crown needed, whether they knew it or not. The rooster's crow cut through the darkness like a rusty blade, pulling Cassidy from dreams of endless roads and empty saddlebags. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The ceiling above her was wrong, the sounds unfamiliar. Then reality settled back into place. The Triple Crown, her trial period, the chance she couldn't afford to waste. Around her, the bunkhouse, stirred to life with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this routine 1,000 times before. Tom was already pulling on his boots, moving with the quiet consideration of someone who knew that dawn came early and complained loudly. Pete rolled out of his bunk with a groan that suggested he'd felt every one of his 30-odd years, while Carlos sat on the edge of his bed, running fingers through dark hair that refused to lie flat. Billy, true to form, was still dead to the world. "Rise and shine, kid," Tom called softly, tossing a boot in the direction of Billy's bunk. "Daylight's burning." "Daylight ain't even here yet," Billy mumbled into his pillow. "It will be by the time you get your lazy bones moving," Pete said, already reaching for his work shirt. "Come on, Billy. First day with the new hand. Don't want to make a bad impression." Cassidy was already dressed and lacing her boots. She'd learned long ago that being ready before anyone expected her to be Ready was one of the small advantages she could claim in a world that seemed determined to find reasons why she couldn't do the job. "You always get up this easy?" Carlos asked, noting her preparedness with approval. "Habit," she said simply. "My father used to say that the sun doesn't wait for anyone, so you better not wait for the sun." Tom chuckled as he strapped on his gun belt. "Smart man, your father. You'll want to grab some coffee and breakfast before we head out. Cookie starts serving at 5:30, stops at 6 whether you're there or not. Cookie, ranch cook. Real. Name's Walter Henderson, but everybody calls him Cookie. Been here longer than anyone except Murphy himself. Makes the best biscuits in 3 counties, but he's got a temper shorter than a snake's shadow. Don't be late, don't ask for special orders, and don't ever criticize his coffee. Even if it's terrible," Pete laughed. "Especially if it's terrible. Trust me on this one." They filed out of the bunkhouse into air so cold it made their breath visible in white puffs. The sky was still dark, but there was a quality to the darkness that suggested dawn was thinking about arriving. Stars wheeled overhead, sharp and bright in the thin mountain air. The cook shack was a low building positioned between the main house and the bunkhouse, with warm yellow light spilling from its windows and the smell of bacon and coffee drifting from its chimney. As they approached, Cassidy could hear the sounds of serious cooking pans clattering, knives chopping, the hiss of meat hitting hot iron. Inside, the cook shack was larger than it had appeared from outside, with long tables that could seat a dozen men and a kitchen area dominated by a massive cast iron stove. The walls were lined with shelves holding dishes, supplies, and various implements whose purposes Cassidy could only guess at. The man working over the stove was shorter than she'd expected, with broad shoulders and arms that spoke of years spent lifting heavy pots and wrestling with stubborn ovens. His hair was completely gray, pulled back in a practical ponytail, and his movements had the precision of someone who knew exactly where everything was and exactly how long everything took. This would be Cookie. "Morning, Walter," Tom said as they found seats at one of the tables. "Morning yourself," Cookie replied without turning around. "Coffee's on the table, biscuits are in the oven, and breakfast'll be ready when it's ready." "Yes, sir." Cassidy poured herself coffee from a pot that looked like it had been through a war, noting that the liquid was black enough to dissolve horseshoes. She took a cautious sip and managed not to wince. It was strong enough to wake the dead, but it was hot and it would keep her alert. That was all that mattered. "So what's the plan for today?" she asked Tom quietly. "High country," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "We're going after the cattle that summer grazed up near Sentinel Pass. It's a steep country, and the animals don't want to come down. We'll need every hand we can get." "How many head are we talking about?" "Maybe 150, scattered across about 5 square miles of the roughest terrain God ever made. Some of them have been up there since early summer, and they're half wild by now." "If then," Pete added grimly. "Lost a dozen head 2 years back when a storm caught them up high. Found the bones the next summer." "Cheerful," Cassidy observed. "It's honest work," Tom said. "But it's not safe work, and it's not easy work. That's why Murphy pays better than most." The kitchen door swung open, and Jackson Murphy himself walked in, looking like he'd been awake for hours. His clothes were already dusty, suggesting he'd been out checking something before dawn, and there was an alertness in his posture that spoke of a man with a dozen things on his mind. "Morning, boys," he said, then nodded to Cassidy. "Mr. Murphy." He poured himself coffee and sat down at the far end of the table, close enough to be part of the conversation, but far enough away to maintain the invisible line between boss and crew. Cassidy had seen this dynamic before, the careful balance between authority and camaraderie that good foremen maintained. "Weather's holding," Jackson said. "Should be clear for the next few days. That gives us a window to get the high country cleaned out before the snow starts." What about the section near Devil's Backbone? Tom asked. Last time I was up there, I saw signs of maybe 20 head. We'll get them, but not today. Today we focus on Sentinel Pass. Those cattle have been up there long enough to think they own the place. Cookie appeared at Jackson's elbow with a plate of bacon, eggs, and biscuits that were still steaming from the oven. He served the rest of them with the same efficiency, each plate identical in its generous portions. Eat up, he said gruffly. It's going to be a long day. The biscuits were, as advertised, exceptional. Light and flaky with a hint of buttermilk, and honey that made them disappear almost faster than Cassidy could chew. The bacon was thick-cut and perfectly cooked, and the eggs had the deep yellow yolks that came from chickens allowed to range free. This is incredible, she said to Cookie, who was already back at his stove, preparing for the midday meal. Course it is, he replied without turning around. Wouldn't serve it if it wasn't. Jackson looked up from his plate. Miss Hayes, you'll be riding with Tom today. He'll show you the country and how we work cattle up there. After that, we'll see how you handle yourself. Yes, sir. You got rope? Yes, sir. Good rope? Or just something that looks like rope? Tom grinned. Boss is particular about equipment. He's seen too many wrecks caused by gear that looked good, but fell apart when it mattered. It's a good rope, Cassidy said. Braided rawhide, made by a fellow in Great Falls who knows his business. What about your horse? She up for mountain work? Copper's been in rough country before. She's sure-footed, and she's got sense. Jackson nodded. That's what matters. Pretty horses are fine for parades, but up in the rocks you need an animal that can think for herself. They finished breakfast in a comfortable quiet, the kind of focused eating that came before hard physical work. Around them, the cook shack, filled with the sounds of preparation, Cookie assembling lunch for the crew, the coffee pot bubbling on the stove, the occasional clink of dishes being washed and put away. Outside, the sky was beginning to show the first pale hints of dawn. The mountains to the east were outlined against a sky that was no longer quite black, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark began its liquid song. Time to move, Jackson said, standing and draining his coffee cup. We want to be in position. By full light, they filed out into the crisp morning air, their breath still visible in white clouds. The stars were fading now, giving way to the gray half-light that preceded sunrise. In the corrals, horses moved restlessly, sensing the approaching activity. Cassidy's first sight of the horse herd in daylight took her breath away. These weren't the rough-coated, hammer-headed animals she'd seen on some ranches. These were quality horses, well-bred, well-fed, and clearly well-trained. Bays and sorrels, a few grays, and a magnificent black stallion that watched the proceedings with intelligent eyes. Murphy breeds his own, Tom explained, noting her interest. Crosses Mustang Mares with thoroughbred stallions. Gets animals with the intelligence and hardiness of the wild horses and the size and speed of the bred ones. They're beautiful. They're useful, Jackson said, appearing beside them with a bridle in his hands. Beauty doesn't keep you alive. When a steer decides to charge, or when your horse has to jump a creek in the dark. He walked into the corral with the confidence of a man who'd never met a horse he couldn't handle. The animals moved around him easily, some approaching to nuzzle his hands, others simply acknowledging his presence with calm acceptance. Which one's mine for the day? Cassidy asked. Depends. How do you like your horses? Smart, willing, and honest. Jackson considered this, then approached a compact sorrel mare with intelligent eyes and a white blaze down her face. This is Penny. She's got more sense than most people, and she doesn't spook easy. She'd take care of you if you take care of her. He led the mare out of the corral and handed Cassidy the lead rope. Penny stood quietly while Cassidy checked her overlegs, hooves, back, the way she moved when asked to step sideways. Everything about the mare spoke of quality and good care. She's lovely, Cassidy said, running her hands down Penny's neck. How old? 7. Been using her for cattle work for 3 years now. She's got cow sense. That was high praise from a rancher. Cow sense was something that couldn't be taught. It was the intuitive, understanding some horses had of how cattle moved and thought. The ability to anticipate what a steer would do before the steer knew it himself. Cassidy saddled Penny with practiced efficiency, checking the cinch twice and adjusting the stirrups to her length. The mare stood quietly throughout the process, occasionally turning her head to watch but never moving her feet. Around them, the other men were preparing their own mounts with the same careful attention to detail. Tom rode a big bay gelding that looked like he could work all day without breaking a sweat. Pete chose a quick-moving paint that danced a little in place, eager to get started. Carlos swung aboard a steady-looking brown horse that had the thick build of an animal bred for endurance rather than speed. Billy, still moving slowly from his abbreviated sleep, was struggling with a fractious young horse that seemed determined to make the morning as difficult as possible. "Need help, kid?" Tom called. "I got him," Billy replied through gritted teeth, finally getting his foot in the stirrup and swinging. Aboard, the horse Crow hopped a few steps, then settled into sulky compliance. Jackson mounted his own horse, a big gray gelding with the kind of presence that commanded respect, and looked over his crew. "We'll head up the North Trail to Sentinel Pass. Tom, you take point. Pete and Carlos work the flanks once we locate the cattle. Billy, you stay with the drag and keep anything from breaking back downhill." "What about me?" Cassidy asked. "You stay with Tom. Watch how we work this country. Ask questions if you need to, but remember that once we start moving cattle, things can happen fast. If you get confused or unsure, get out of the way and let someone else handle it." It wasn't exactly a vote of confidence, but it wasn't an insult either. It was the kind of careful instruction a good boss gave to any new hand working unfamiliar territory. They rode out as the sun crested the eastern peaks, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. The morning air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and sage and the distant promise of snow. Somewhere high above, a hawk circled on thermals that were just beginning to form as the earth warmed. The trail up to Sentinel Pass was steeper than it had looked from below, winding back and forth across the face of the mountain in a series of switchbacks that tested both horse and rider. Penny took it in stride, her sure feet finding secure purchase on rock and loose shale, her breathing steady despite the climbing. "First time in this country?" Tom asked, riding beside her. "First time this high," Cassidy replied. "Worked some hill country down near Billings, but nothing like this. It's different up here. Air's thinner, weather changes faster, and the country's harder on both horses and cattle. Animals get spooked easier too, something about the altitude, maybe, or just the wildness of it." As they climbed higher, the character of the landscape changed. The grassland of the valley gave way to scattered stands of pine and aspen, then to more open country broken by outcroppings of granite and limestone. The trail became less defined, more a suggestion worn by generations of game animals than an actual road. "How do you find cattle in a country like this?" Cassidy asked. "Same way you find anything else. You look in the places they're likely to be. Water sources, sheltered areas, good grass. Cattle are predictable if you understand what they need. And if they're not where they're supposed to be," Tom grinned, "then you expand your definition of where they're supposed to be and keep looking." They rode for an hour before Jackson, who'd been scouting ahead, raised his hand in a signal for quiet. The crew bunched up behind him, horses stamping and blowing in the thin air. "Found them," he said quietly. "Maybe 40 head in that basin below the ridge. They're scattered but not spooked. If we're careful, we can ease them down without too much trouble." Cassidy could see them now, dark shapes, moving slowly through the grass of a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside. From this distance, they looked peaceful, almost domestic, but she could see the way they held their heads high, alert for any sign of danger. "Here's how we'll work it," Jackson continued. Tom and Miss Hayes will circle around to the far side, get above them. Pete and Carlos will take the flanks. Billy, you position yourself at the mouth of the basin and make sure nothing breaks back. Uphill, I'll start them moving from below. What if they decide to go the wrong direction? Cassidy asked. Then we let them go and try again tomorrow. Never chase spooked cattle into rough country. That's how people get hurt. They spread out according to the plan, each rider taking a different route to their assigned position. Cassidy followed Tom along a narrow ledge that skirted the basin, noting how Penny seemed to understand the work without being told. The Mare moved quietly, keeping to the shadows where possible, her ears forward but relaxed. She's done this before, Cassidy observed, many times. Penny's one of the best cattle horses on the ranch. Murphy doesn't usually let new hands ride her, but I guess he figured you'd earned the privilege. They reached their position above the cattle and settled in to wait for Jackson's signal. From here, Cassidy could see the entire operation, Pete and Carlos moving into position on opposite sides of the basin, Billy waiting at the natural choke point where the cattle would have to pass to get back to higher ground. It was like watching a carefully choreographed dance, each rider knowing exactly where to be and when to be there. Jackson appeared at the lower end of the basin, moving slowly and deliberately. The cattle saw him immediately. Heads came up, ears pricked forward. The eternal calculation of flight or fight that drove all prey animals. For a moment, nothing happened. The cattle watched Jackson, Jackson watched the cattle, and the rest of the crew waited for someone to make the first move. Then, as if responding to some signal only they could perceive, the cattle began to drift away from Jackson, moving uphill toward the mouth of the basin. It wasn't panic, not yet, just the cautious retreat of animals who preferred to keep their options open. Now, Tom said quietly, and they began their own movement, staying high but visible enough to encourage the cattle to keep moving in the right direction. For the next hour, they worked the herd down the mountain with a patience that bordered on the artistic. No sudden movements, no shouting, no rushing. Just the steady pressure of riders in the right positions at the right times, guiding the cattle along the path of least resistance. Cassidy found herself swept up in the rhythm of it. This was different from the rough and tumble cattle work she'd done before. This was almost gentle, a conversation between human and animal that relied on understanding rather than force. "You're getting it," Tom said approvingly as they paused to let the cattle rest in a small meadow. "Most folks want to hurry things along, but cattle work better when they think it's their idea. My father used to say that the best cowboys were the ones who could make a cow believe it wanted to go where you wanted it to go. Smart man, your father." They were halfway down the mountain when things went wrong. It started with a single steer, a big red animal that had been eyeing the escape route since they'd started moving. A sudden sound, a shadow, maybe just the accumulated stress of being pushed out of his comfortable summer range, spooked him into bolting. In an instant, the careful calm of the drive dissolved into chaos. The red steer's panic infected the animals around him, and suddenly half the herd was running in 3 different directions. "Hold them!" Jackson shouted, spurring his horse toward a group of cattle that was heading for a narrow canyon that would trap them against vertical walls. Pete and Carlos were already moving, their horses sliding down steep slopes in controlled falls that would have terrified anyone who didn't understand that a good cow horse was worth its weight in gold. Tom looked at Cassidy. "You up for this?" She was already turning Penny toward a group of cattle that was streaming toward a gap in the rocks. "Let's find out." What followed was the most intense 20 minutes of Cassidy's life. Penny proved that her reputation was well-deserved, anticipating the movements of frightened cattle with an intelligence that bordered on the supernatural. The Mare could turn on ground no bigger than a dinner plate, stop from a dead run in 3 strides, and somehow always seemed to know which way a steer was going to jump before the steer did. Cassidy found herself riding harder and faster then. she ever had before, her rope singing through the air as she turned back animal after animal. The country that had seemed merely challenging during the slow drive down suddenly became a deadly obstacle course of loose rock, hidden holes, and drops that could kill horse and rider alike, but gradually, through skill and luck and the kind of teamwork that came from working with people who knew their business, they managed to gather the scattered cattle back into a manageable group. When it was over, when the last wild-eyed steer had been convinced to rejoin the herd, Cassidy found herself breathing hard and covered in sweat, despite the cool mountain air. "Nice work," Jackson said, riding up beside her. His hat was gone, lost somewhere in the chaos, and there was a tear in his shirt where a tree branch had caught him. "Thank you, sir. That was some riding. Penny doesn't usually take to new riders that quickly." Cassidy patted the mare's neck, feeling the fine tremor of exertion in the muscles beneath her hand. "She's quite a horse." "She is that." Jackson looked around at his crew, taking inventory. Everyone was present and accounted for, though they all looked like they'd been through a windstorm. "Anyone hurt?" "Billy got skinned up some when his horse went down," Pete called out. "But nothing serious." "Good. Let's get these cattle home before they decide to give us any more excitement." The rest of the drive passed without incident, the cattle apparently having exhausted their enthusiasm for adventure. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was high overhead, and Cassidy felt like she'd been working for a week. But as they herded the cattle into the holding pens near the ranch buildings, she also felt something else, a sense of accomplishment that came from hard work well done, and the knowledge that she'd proven herself capable of handling whatever the Triple Crown could throw at her, at least for one day. The second week of October brought the first real cold snap, and with it, a crisis that would test everything Cassidy had learned about the Triple Crown and the men who worked it. She'd been on the ranch for 8 days now. 8 days of proving herself one small task at a time. The high country cattle drive had earned her a measure of respect from the crew, but respect in ranch work was something that had to be renewed daily. Every morning brought new challenges, new opportunities to either build on what she'd accomplished or watch it all crumble under the weight of a single mistake. The work had been varied and demanding. 2 days were spent repairing the fence line that had been damaged by a fallen tree. A morning breaking ice on water tanks when an unexpected freeze caught them unprepared. An afternoon training a young gelding that had more spirit than sense, teaching him that humans were partners, not enemies. Each task had been a test, and so far, she'd passed them all, but she could sense something building. Some unspoken tension in the way Jackson watched her work, the way Tom asked careful questions about her experience with difficult situations. They were leading up to something, waiting for the right moment to present her with a challenge that would either prove she belonged here or send her back down the road with 2 weeks' wages and a polite dismissal. That moment came on a Thursday morning when Tom woke the crew an hour before dawn with news that turned the comfortable routine of ranch life upside down. "We got problems," he announced, lighting the oil lamp beside his bunk. "Big problems." Around him, the other hand stirred to consciousness with the reluctant groaning of men who'd hoped for another hour of sleep. "What kind of problems?" Pete asked, already reaching for his clothes. "The kind that involves 200 head of prize, breeding stock, and a broken section of fence that nobody noticed until this morning." That got everyone's attention. Carlos sat up in his bunk, instantly alert. "How much fence?" "Quarter mile, maybe more. Storm last night brought down 3 trees. Right across the north pasture boundary. Cattle wandered through sometime after midnight, and now they're scattered across about 10 square miles of the roughest country on the ranch." Billy, still half asleep, tried to process this information. "Can't we just round them up like we did the high country cattle?" "These aren't range cattle, kid," Tom explained patiently. "These are registered breeding stock bulls worth more than you'll make in 5 years, cows with bloodlines that go back to Scotland. They're not used to being pushed around, and they're not going to cooperate just because we ask nicely. Cassidy was already lacing her boots. How long do we have? Storm's supposed to hit again tomorrow night, and it's going to be a bad one. Snow, wind, temperatures that'll kill anything caught in the open. We need those animals back in the paddocks before then, or we're looking at losses that could bankrupt the ranch. The gravity of the situation settled over the bunkhouse like a heavy blanket. Cassidy had heard about operations that lost everything to a single bad storm, had seen the abandoned buildings and rusted equipment that marked places where someone's dreams had died in a single night of brutal weather. What's the plan? She asked. That's up to Murphy. He's been out since before dawn, trying to get a count on how many we've lost and where they might have gone. They dressed in the kind of focused silence that preceded serious work, each person running through mental checklists of gear and tactics. This wasn't routine cattle work, this was crisis management, the kind of situation where experience and quick thinking could mean the difference between success and disaster. Outside, the pre-dawn air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter. The stars overhead seemed brittle in the cold, and the wind that swept down from the mountains held the promise of snow. Weather in this country could change faster than a man could saddle a horse, and the signs all pointed to something serious. Brewing in the high peaks. The cook shack was already lit when they arrived, Cookie moving around his stove with the purposeful energy of a man who understood that emergencies required fuel for both body and spirit. The smell of bacon and strong coffee filled the air, but underneath it was something else, the tension that came when people who depended on each other for their livelihood faced a threat that could destroy everything they'd worked to build. Jackson was already there, standing at the far end of the long table with a hand-drawn map spread out before him. His clothes were wet with dew and mud, and there were scratches on his hands that suggested he'd been crawling through brush in the dark. "Morning," he said without looking up from the map. "Hope everyone got enough sleep, because you're not going to see another bed until this is finished." "How bad is it?" Tom asked. "Bad enough. I found sign of at least 150 head that went through the break in the fence." They split into 3 groups. One headed north toward Willow Creek. One went east into the timber, and the third group went up toward Devil's Canyon. Cassidy studied the map over his shoulder, noting the terrain features he'd marked. Willow Creek was relatively open country, good for horses and not too difficult for moving cattle. The timber would be harder thick forest that limited visibility and provided plenty of places for animals to hide. But Devil's Canyon was the real problem. "What's so bad about the canyon?" she asked. Jackson looked up at her, his expression grim. "It's a box canyon with walls too steep for cattle to climb out. If they get spooked and run to the back end, they'll be trapped. And if the storm hits while they're in there..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood what happened to animals caught in a box canyon during a blizzard. "So we have 3 groups in 3 different types of country, and less than 2 days to bring them all home," Pete summarized. "That's about the size of it." "What about help from neighboring ranches?" Carlos asked. "This kind of situation, most folks would lend a hand." Jackson shook his head. "Closest neighbor is 40 miles away, and they've got their own problems with the storm coming. We're on our own." Cookie appeared at Jackson's elbow with a plate of food and a cup of coffee that steamed in the cold air. "Eat," he said gruffly. "All of you. Going to be a long day." They ate quickly and in relative silence, each person lost in their own thoughts about the challenges ahead. Cassidy found herself running through everything she knew about cattle behavior, trying to anticipate the problems they'd face in each location. Range cattle were one thing. They were used to being moved, accustomed to the pressure of riders and dogs, but breeding stock was different. These animals had been pampered, fed grain and hay, protected from the kind of stress that range cattle dealt with daily. They'd be harder to predict, more likely to panic, less willing to cooperate. "Here's how we'll divide up," Jackson said when they'd finished eating. Tom, you take Pete and Billy and work for the Willow Creek group. That's probably the largest bunch, and the country's open enough that you can use traditional driving techniques. Tom nodded. What about the timber? Carlos and I will take that group. The trees will slow us down, but at least the cattle won't be able to run very far before they hit something that stops them. And Devil's Canyon? Cassidy asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Jackson's eyes met hers across the table. That's where you come in, Miss Hayes, if you're willing. The sudden attention of every man in the room focused on her like the beam of a lantern. This was it, the real test, the moment when her trial period would be decided one way or another. What makes that job different from the others? She asked carefully. A dozen things. The canyon's narrow and rocky, so you can't use a team of riders. The cattle that went in there are probably the most skittish of the bunch. They ran the farthest and the fastest. And if something goes wrong, if they panic and stampede toward the back of the canyon, there's no way out except the way you came in. You're talking about a one-person job. I'm talking about a job that requires someone with exceptional horsemanship and a cool head under pressure. Someone who can read cattle well enough to know when they're about to bolt, and skilled enough to prevent it when they do. Tom leaned forward. Jackson, that's awfully risky for anyone, let alone a woman? Cassidy finished quietly. Let alone someone who's been here 8 days, Tom said diplomatically. Jackson was still looking at her. The choice is yours, Miss Hayes. I won't order you to take a job that is dangerous. But if you're willing to try it, and if you can pull it off, it'll settle any questions about whether you belong on this crew. Cassidy understood what he was offering her, not just a job, but a chance to prove herself in a way that would end all doubts about her abilities. It was also a chance to fail spectacularly, to get herself or valuable animals killed, to destroy any future she might have had in ranch work. But when she thought about riding away from the Triple Crown with nothing to show for her effort except 2 weeks' wages, the risk seemed worth taking. I'll need my best equipment, she said, whatever you want. And I want to choose my own horse. Done. And if I bring those cattle home, I want your word that the trial period is over. That I have a permanent place here. Jackson extended his hand across the table. You bring those cattle home safe, and you've got a job for as long as you want it. They shook on it, and Cassidy felt the weight of every eye in the room. This was either the smartest thing she'd ever done, or the stupidest, and she wouldn't know which until it was too late to change her mind. The next hour was spent in careful preparation. Cassidy chose Copper over the ranch horses, trusting her own Mare's training and temperament over animals she didn't know well enough. She checked her rope 3 times, selected a spare from the tack room, and made sure her rifle was clean and loaded. Jackson walked her through the approach to Devil's Canyon, using the map to show her the landmarks and potential trouble spots. The entrance is narrow, maybe 30 feet across at the mouth, but it widens out to about 100 yards once you get inside. The cattle are probably about half a mile back from the entrance, in a meadow where there's good grass and water. Oh, many head. I counted tracks for maybe 40 animals. Could be more, mixed ages and sexes. Mostly cows with spring calves, but there's at least 1 bull in the group. Big Hereford named Goliath. He's usually gentle, but bulls can be unpredictable when they're stressed. Cassidy studied the map, memorizing the details. What's the ground? Like in the canyon? Rocky but not impossible. Creek runs down the middle, so it'll be muddy near the water. Watch out for washouts and hidden holes. This time of year, you can't always see what's under the grass. And if they decide to run, Jackson's expression was grave. Then you get out of their way and try to survive. 40 head of panicked cattle in a narrow canyon is not something you want to be in front of. By the time the sun was fully up, they were ready to move. The 3 groups split up at the ranch gate, each heading toward their assigned territory with the grim determination of people who understood that failure wasn't just personal, it could destroy the livelihood of everyone involved. Cassidy rode north toward the broken country that led to Devil's Canyon, following a game trail that wound through stands of aspen and pine. The morning air was crisp and clear, but she could see clouds building on the western horizon, dark masses that promised the storm Jackson had warned about. Copper moved easily beneath her. The Mare's ears pricked forward with interest rather than concern. They'd worked together long enough that Cassidy could read her horse's mood as easily as her own, and Copper's calm confidence helped settle her own nerves. The approach to Devil's Canyon was everything Jackson had described and worse. The trail wound through increasingly rough country, following the course of a creek that had carved deep channels through layers of limestone and shale. The closer she got to the canyon entrance, the more confined the landscape became, until she was riding between walls of rock that rose 50 feet on either side. The canyon mouth opened suddenly, a gap in the rock face that revealed the wider valley beyond. Cassidy paused at the entrance, studying the ground for sign and listening for the sounds that would tell her where the cattle had gone. She found what she was looking for, almost immediately: fresh tracks in the soft earth beside the creek. The unmistakable evidence of cattle that had passed this way recently. The tracks headed deeper into the canyon, following the easiest route along the water. "Well, girl," she said quietly to Copper, "time to see what we're made of." They entered the canyon at a steady walk, Cassidy's eyes constantly moving as she read the sign left by the missing cattle. The tracks were clear and easy to follow, but what concerned her was the pattern they made. These animals had been moving fast when they entered the canyon, driven by something that had spooked them badly. Spooked cattle were unpredictable cattle, and unpredictable cattle could kill you. The canyon walls rose higher as they moved deeper into the geological formation, and the sense of confinement grew stronger with every step. This was not a place where you wanted to be caught in a stampede, not a place where quick escape was possible. After 20 minutes of careful riding, she heard them, the low murmur of cattle at rest, the occasional bellow of a calf calling for its mother. The sound came from around a bend in the canyon, where the walls opened up into the meadow Jackson had described. Cassidy dismounted and ground-tied Copper, then crept forward on foot to get her first look at what she was dealing with. What she saw when she peered around the rocky outcropping made her heart sink. 43 head of prime breeding stock were scattered across a natural meadow, but they weren't the calm, contented animals she'd hoped to find. These cattle were on edge, heads up and ears forward, showing all the signs of animals that had been badly frightened and hadn't yet calmed down. And standing in the center of the group, pawing the ground and snorting challenges at shadows, was the biggest bull she'd ever seen in her life. Goliath lived up to his name in every respect. He stood nearly 6 feet at the shoulder, with the massive frame and thick neck of a bull bred for both size and aggression. His horns spread wide and sharp, and his eyes held the kind of intelligence that made him more dangerous than a merely large animal would have been. Between her and the cattle, the meadow was crossed by several deep gullies carved by spring runoff, and the ground was rough with scattered boulders and hidden holes. It was exactly the kind of terrain where a horse could break a leg or a rider could be thrown at the worst possible moment. Cassidy spent 10 minutes studying the situation, looking for advantages and trying to anticipate problems. The cattle were bunched together in a way that suggested they'd been frightened into solidarity, but that same bunching could work against her. If they decided to run as a group, the key would be getting them started toward the canyon entrance, without triggering the kind of panic that would send them charging deeper into the box canyon. And to do that, she'd have to get past Goliath, without provoking him into a charge that could scatter the entire herd. She returned to Copper and checked her equipment one more time, making sure everything was secure and easily accessible. This was the kind of work that could change from routine to deadly in the space of a heartbeat, and being prepared could mean the difference between success and disaster. Easy does it, she murmured to herself as much as to her horse. Nothing fancy, nothing rushed, just good, steady work. She mounted and rode slowly around the bend, letting the cattle see her coming from a distance. The reaction was immediate. Heads came up all across the meadow, and the general murmur of contented animals shifted to the sharper notes of alarm. Goliath spotted her first, his massive head swinging toward her with the ponderous menace of a siege engine training on its target. For a moment, he stood perfectly still, evaluating this new threat to his herd. Then he began to advance, and Cassidy realized that her carefully planned approach was about to become a test of survival. Goliath's advance was deliberate, purposeful, like a landslide gathering momentum. Each step sent tremors through the ground beneath Copper's hooves, and Cassidy could hear the deep rumble in the bull's chest that preceded either submission or violence. In her experience, bulls this size rarely chose submission. "Easy, boy," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the meadow with the kind of calm authority her father had taught her to project even when her heart was hammering against her ribs. "Nobody's here to hurt your ladies." The bull stopped, 20 yards away, lowering his massive head until his horns pointed directly at her. Steam rose from his nostrils in the cold air, and his eyes held the kind of intelligence that made him more dangerous than a simple animal driven by instinct. Goliath was evaluating her, the same way she was evaluating him. The question was whether he saw her as a threat to be eliminated or an annoyance to be discouraged. The difference could mean life or death for both of them. Behind the bull, the cattle had begun to mill restlessly, sensing the tension between their protector and this new presence in their sanctuary. Several cows called out to calves that had wandered too far from their sides, and the sound echoed off the canyon walls with an urgency that suggested panic wasn't far away. Cassidy knew she had perhaps 30 seconds to establish the dynamic. That would define everything that followed. Show too much aggression, and Goliath would charge. Show too much fear, and he'd drive her out of the canyon entirely. What she needed was the kind of firm but non-threatening presence that would convince him she belonged here without challenging his authority over the herd. She dismounted slowly, keeping her movements smooth and predictable. Copper stood like a statue, trusting her rider's judgment even in the face of an animal that could crush them both without effort. The mare's calm was as much a tool as any rope or bridle. Cattle responded to confidence, and a nervous horse would communicate fear faster than any human could project reassurance. "That's it," Cassidy murmured, taking a single step forward. "Just having a conversation here. No need for drama." Goliath's response was immediate. He pawed the ground with one massive hoof, sending dirt and stones flying. A warning that couldn't be mistaken for anything else. Cassidy stopped moving forward, but didn't retreat. This was the crucial moment, the test that would determine whether she could proceed with her mission, or whether she'd have to find another way to move these cattle. In her peripheral vision, she could see storm clouds building over the canyon rim. Dark masses that promised the weather Jackson had warned about was arriving ahead of schedule. She couldn't afford a standoff that lasted hours. She needed to either gain Goliath's cooperation or find a way around him that wouldn't scatter the herd to the four winds. "I've got a proposition for you, big fellow," she said, her voice carrying the conversational tone she'd use with any difficult animal. "These ladies of yours are going to freeze to death if they stay here much longer. Now I can help them get somewhere warm and safe, or we can all stand here and argue until the snow buries us. What's it going to be?" The bull tilted his head slightly, as if actually considering her words. It was probably imagination, but Cassidy had learned to trust the small signs that separated successful animal handlers from dead ones. Moving with exaggerated care, she reached into her saddlebag and pulled out an apple she'd saved from breakfast. It wasn't much, but it was a gesture that every ranch animal understood. Food meant friendship, or at least neutrality. She held the apple out toward Goliath, keeping her arm extended but not moving closer. "Peace offering," she said. "No strings attached." For a long moment, nothing happened. The bull stood motionless, steam rising from his hide in the cold air, his eyes fixed on the woman who dared to stand in his territory. Around them, the cattle watched with the kind of intense attention that prey animals gave to any situation that might determine their survival. Then, with movements surprisingly delicate for an animal his size, Goliath took a step forward. Then, another. He stopped just out of arm's reach, his massive head extended toward the apple, but his body positioned to charge if this turned out to be some kind of trick. "That's right," Cassidy said softly. "Just a snack between friends." She tossed the apple gently, landing it in the grass halfway between them. Goliath studied it for a moment, then lowered his head and picked it up with lips that could have crushed it to pulp, but instead handled it with surprising gentleness. The crunch of apple between massive teeth seemed to break the tension that had held the meadow frozen. Several of the cows moved closer, curious about this interaction between their protector and the stranger. A few calves began to nurse, the eternal optimism of the young overriding their mother's caution. But Cassidy knew that one apple hadn't solved her problem. It had only bought her a few minutes of relative peace in which to figure out how to move 43 head of valuable cattle out of a box canyon without triggering a stampede that could kill them all. The key would be understanding the herd's psychology. These weren't range cattle accustomed to being moved by humans. They were breeding stock that had lived most of their lives in relative comfort, protected from the stresses that made ordinary cattle manageable. They'd been frightened into this canyon by something, probably the storm, and a broken fence, and their instinct would be to stay where they felt safe rather than venture into the unknown. What she needed was a way to make leaving seem like their idea rather than hers. Cassidy remounted Copper and began to ride slowly around the perimeter of the meadow, not approaching the cattle directly, but making herself a constant, non-threatening presence. It was a technique her father had taught her for dealing with skittish animals. Let them get used to you before you ask them to do anything. As she rode, she studied the individuals within the herd, looking for the natural leaders and followers that existed in any group of cattle. There was always a hierarchy, always animals that others looked to for guidance. If she could identify the right cow and convince her to start moving toward the canyon entrance, the rest might follow. She found what she was looking for in a mature Hereford cow with the kind of calm intelligence that marked a natural leader. The cow had positioned herself at the edge of the group where she could watch for threats while keeping an eye on her calf, and several other animals had arranged themselves around her in a way that suggested deference. This was her target: convince this cow to move, and she might be able to get the whole herd started toward safety. But first, she had to deal with Goliath, who had finished his apple and resumed his position as guardian of the herd. The bull was watching her circuit of the meadow with obvious suspicion, his massive head turning to track her movement like an artillery piece following a target. "Time for the next part of our negotiation," she said quietly, guiding Copper toward a position that would put her between the herd and the canyon entrance. It was a risky move. If things went wrong, she'd be trapped between angry cattle and a dead end. But if she was going to move these animals, she needed to position herself where she could guide them in the right direction. The response was immediate. Goliath snorted a challenge and began moving toward her, his intent unmistakable. He wasn't going to allow her to get between him and the only escape route from the canyon. This was the moment Cassidy had been dreading and preparing for since she'd first seen the massive bull. There was no way around it. She was going to have to outmaneuver an animal that outweighed her horse by more than 1,000 pounds. In terrain that favored the bull's size and power over her mobility, she turned Copper toward the approaching bull and began to ride directly at him, a maneuver that went against every instinct for self-preservation she possessed. But sometimes the only way through a dangerous situation was straight ahead. And she'd learned that showing fear to a dominant animal was a sure way to get hurt. 20 yards separated them. 15. 10. At the last possible moment, when collision seemed inevitable, Cassidy reined Copper hard to the left and spurred the mare into a sharp turn that carried them around Goliath's right side. The bull tried to follow, his massive bulk swinging around like a ship changing course, but Copper's agility allowed them to stay just out of reach of those deadly horns. What followed was a deadly dance that played out across the rocky meadow. Goliath would charge, Copper would sidestep, and Cassidy would use her horse's speed and maneuverability to stay one step ahead of destruction. It was like trying to fight a locomotive with a feather. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and the contest would be over. But gradually something began to change in the dynamic between them. Goliath's charges became less aggressive, more perfunctory, as if he was going through the motions because his role as protector demanded it, rather than because he truly saw her as a threat. And Cassidy began to notice that her maneuvers were slowly, almost imperceptibly, moving the bull away from his central position in the herd. The cattle were becoming restless, uncertain about what was happening between their guardian and this persistent intruder. Several cows had begun to move toward the canyon entrance, not in panic but with the kind of nervous energy that suggested they were ready to leave. If given a clear signal, this was her chance. Instead of continuing to evade Goliath's charges, Cassidy suddenly changed tactics. When the bull next positioned himself for an attack, she rode not away from him but around him, using Copper's agility to circle behind the herd and position herself where she could begin encouraging movement toward the canyon mouth. "Come on, ladies," she called out, her voice carrying the kind of confident authority that cattle responded to. "Time to go home." The lead cow, the intelligent Hereford Cassidy had identified earlier, lifted her head and looked toward the canyon entrance as if considering the suggestion. Several other animals followed her gaze, and Cassidy could see the moment when the idea of leaving began to take hold in the collective mind of the herd. Goliath wasn't ready to give up his position as guardian. With a bellow that echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, he charged again, this time with the kind of single-minded determination that suggested he decided this confrontation needed to end. Cassidy had perhaps 3 seconds to make a decision. That would determine whether she lived through the next minute. She could try to evade the charge as she had before, but Goliath was learning from their previous encounters, positioning himself to cut off her escape routes. Or she could do something so unexpected that it might shock him into reconsidering his attack. She chose the unexpected. Instead of fleeing from the charging bull, Cassidy spurred Copper directly toward him, raising herself in the stirrups and letting out a wild yell that her father had taught her for dealing with stubborn animals. It was part war cry, part challenge, and part expression of absolutely fearless determination. The effect on Goliath was electric. The massive bull stumbled to a halt not 10 feet away, his charge broken by sheer surprise. For a moment he stood, frozen, trying to process the fact that this small human had just challenged him to single combat. In that moment of hesitation, Cassidy seized her opportunity. She wheeled Copper around and rode toward the nervous cattle, her voice raised in the kind of authoritative commands that spoke to something deep in their domesticated instincts. "Move out. Come on, girls, time to go." The lead cow took the first step, then another. Behind her, the rest of the herd began to shift and flow like water finding its course. Calves scrambled to keep up with their mothers, and the sound of hooves on stone began to fill the canyon with the music of movement. Goliath stood watching this exodus with what seemed like confusion. His charges had failed to drive off the intruder, and now his herd was leaving without him. For a bull whose entire purpose was to protect these animals, the situation was unprecedented. Cassidy kept the cattle moving with a combination of patience and pressure, letting them set their own pace while making sure they continued toward the canyon entrance. It was delicate work pushed too hard, and they'd panic. Too gentle, and they'd stop moving altogether. The passage through the narrow canyon mouth was the most dangerous part of the operation. 43 animals trying to squeeze through a 30-foot opening created the perfect conditions for a deadly pileup if anything went wrong. Cassidy positioned herself where she could see the entire operation, ready to react if any animal decided to turn back, or if the pressure of confinement triggered the kind of panic that could crush cattle and rider alike. But the lead cow maintained her steady pace, and the rest of the herd followed her example. One by one, they passed through the stone gateway and emerged into the wider country beyond, where the risk of stampede was less and the possibility of escape much greater. Goliath was the last to leave, stopping at the canyon entrance to look back at the meadow that had been his kingdom for however brief a time. Then, with the dignity of a monarch accepting exile, he walked through the opening and took his place at the head of his herd. The journey back to the ranch was a 3-hour exercise in patience and vigilance. The cattle, now that they were moving, seemed content to continue, but they remained skittish and ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. Cassidy rode point, setting a pace that was fast enough to beat the approaching storm, but not so fast that it would stress animals that were already on edge. Behind her, Goliath had reasserted his authority over the herd, positioning himself where he could watch for threats while keeping the cows and calves moving in the right direction. The massive bull seemed to have accepted her leadership of this particular expedition, but she had no illusions that he wouldn't revert to aggression if he perceived any threat to his charges. The first snowflakes began to fall as they crested the ridge that overlooked the Triple Crown Ranch buildings. What had been threatening clouds on the horizon that morning had become a full-fledged storm system, and the wind that swept down from the peaks carried the promise of the kind of weather that could kill anything caught in the open. They'd made it with less than an hour to spare. The sight that greeted Cassidy as they approached the ranch filled her with a relief so profound it made her dizzy. Tom's group was just finishing the job of getting their cattle into the holding pens, and she could see Jackson and Carlos working the last few animals from the timber into the safety of the corrals. All 3 groups had succeeded. All the scattered cattle were accounted for, and they'd beaten the storm that could have destroyed everything Jackson had worked to build. But even as relief flooded through her, Cassidy realized that her real test was just beginning. She'd proven she could handle the work, but now she had to prove she could handle the aftermath, the questions, the evaluation, the decision about whether her place on the crew was permanent or temporary. Jackson was waiting at the corral gate as she guided Goliath and his herd into the safety of the paddock. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the tension in his shoulders begin to ease as the last calf disappeared behind the solid walls that would protect them from the approaching blizzard. "How many?" he asked simply. 43 head, all accounted for. No injuries, no losses. "Goliath give you any trouble?" Cassidy looked back at the massive bull, who was already settling his herd into their new surroundings with the efficiency of an experienced patriarch. "We reached an understanding." Jackson's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "I imagine you did." Tom approached, leading his exhausted horse and wearing the kind of satisfied expression that came from hard work successfully completed. "That was some piece of riding, Miss Hayes. We saw you coming down the ridge with that bull walking behind you like a trained dog." "He's not trained," Cassidy said, dismounting from Copper with legs that shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. "He's just practical. Figured out that cooperation got him what he wanted better than fighting did." "Smart bull," Pete observed, joining the group at the corral. "Smart cowgirl, too." The word hung in the air for a moment. Cowgirl, not ranch hand or hired help, but the term that acknowledged both her gender and her skill without making either seem like a limitation. Jackson walked over to where she stood beside her, trembling horse, his expression serious. "Miss Hayes, I believe we had an agreement." "Yes, sir, we did." "You brought those cattle home safe, which was your part of the bargain." My part was to offer you a permanent place on this crew." He extended his hand toward her. "Welcome to the Triple Crown, Cassidy, for as long as you want to stay." The handshake was firm and warm, and when she met his eyes, she saw something there that hadn't been present 2 weeks ago: respect earned through performance under pressure, and perhaps something else that she wasn't quite ready to name. "Thank you, Mr. Murphy. I won't let you down." "I don't believe you will." As the first serious snow began to fall and the wind picked up to a howl that promised a long, hard night, Cassidy Hayes stood in the shelter of the Triple Crown's buildings and felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death: the sense of belonging somewhere, of being valued for what she could do rather than limited by what she was. She'd found her place at last, and she intended to keep it. The blizzard that followed the cattle rescue lasted 3 days and changed everything about life at the Triple Crown, not just the landscape, though the snow transformed the ranch into a crystalline world where familiar landmarks disappeared under drifts that reached the eaves of buildings, but the relationships between the people who worked the land. Cassidy woke on the 4th morning to silence so complete it seemed to press against her eardrums. The wind that had howled like a living thing for 72 hours had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world muffled in white perfection. Through the frost-covered window of the bunkhouse, she could see snow piled higher than a man's head against the barn doors, and icicles hanging from the roof like crystal daggers. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom said from his bunk, his breath visible in the cold air. It finally stopped. The bunkhouse stove had gone out sometime during the night, and the temperature inside wasn't much warmer than outside. Billy was still curled under every blanket he owned, while Pete and Carlos were already pulling on extra layers of clothing in preparation for what they all knew would be hours of digging. "How much do you figure we got?" Carlos asked, lacing his boots with fingers that moved stiffly in the cold. 3 feet, maybe 4, Tom replied, studying the view from the window. "Could be worse. Could be better. But it's going to take most of the day just to dig paths between the buildings." Cassidy dressed quickly, adding a wool sweater her mother had knitted years ago to her usual work clothes. The sweater still smelled faintly of the lavender her mother had loved, a scent that brought memories of a life that seemed impossibly far away from this snowbound ranch. But as she pulled on her boots and prepared to face whatever challenges the storm had left behind, she realized that those memories no longer carried the sharp edge of loss they once had. The Triple Crown was becoming home in a way that had less to do with the place itself than with the people she shared it with. The cook shack was the first priority. Cookie would need help digging out the kitchen so he could prepare hot food for the crew. But when they opened the bunkhouse door, they discovered that someone had already been at work. A narrow but perfectly functional path had been carved through the snow, leading from their door to the cook shack and continuing onto the main barn. The work showed the kind of systematic thinking that came from years of dealing with Montana winters, not just random digging, but a planned network of passages that would allow efficient movement between the essential buildings. "Murphy," Tom said with approval. "Man probably hasn't slept since the storm started." They found Jackson inside the cook shack, helping Cookie clear snow away from the kitchen windows. He looked like he'd been working for hours. His clothes were soaked with melted snow, and his hands were red with cold, despite the heavy gloves he wore. "Morning," he said without stopping his work. "Storm's passed, but we've got problems." "What kind of problems?" Cassidy asked, accepting a cup of coffee from Cookie that steamed like a beacon of civilization in the frigid air. "Roof problems. Mostly. The snow load is heavier than the horse barn was built to handle. I can hear the timbers creaking every time the wind shifts. If it doesn't get cleared off soon, we could lose the whole structure." Pete whistled low. "That's a big roof. 60 feet by 40 feet. And steep enough that anyone working up there is going to be risking a fall that could kill them." Jackson paused in his shoveling to look around at his crew. I'm not ordering anyone to do it. But if we don't get that snow off, we'll lose 12 horses and probably the building too." The silence that followed wasn't the hesitation of people unwilling to take risks. It was the quiet of professionals calculating the best way to handle a dangerous job. Cassidy had seen it before, the way good workers approached problems that required both courage and intelligence. "What's the plan?" Tom asked. "Rope work mostly. Tie off to the ridge beam and work our way down the slope, pushing snow off as we go. 2 people on the roof, 2 on the ground managing ropes and watching for problems." "I'll take the roof," Cassidy said immediately. Jackson looked at her with surprise. "That's not what? Not a job for a woman?" The words came out sharper than she'd intended, but the morning was too cold and the situation too serious for diplomatic phrasing. "Not a job for someone who doesn't have experience with this kind of work," Jackson finished quietly. "Roof work in winter conditions is specialized. Dangerous in ways that aren't obvious until it's too late." "Then teach me," she said simply. "I learn fast, and I'm not afraid of heights." Tom leaned forward. "Jackson, she's got a point. We're going to need everyone we can get for this job, and she's already proven she can handle herself in tough situations." Jackson studied her for a long moment, and Cassidy could see him weighing factors she could only guess at. The practical need for help against the risks of inexperience. The value of her proven skills against the unknown challenges of this particular task. "All right," he said finally. "But you follow orders exactly, no improvisation, no initiative unless I specifically ask for it. This is the kind of work where one mistake kills people." "Understood." The next hour was spent in careful preparation. Jackson explained the techniques for working on snow-covered roofs, how to read the surface for signs of instability, how to distribute weight to avoid breaking through, how to manage ropes so that a fall wouldn't become a death sentence. Equipment was simple but critical: ropes, shovels, and the kind of calm attention to detail that kept dangerous work from becoming deadly work. Cassidy found herself thinking of her father's advice about working with unpredictable animals: respect the danger, prepare for the worst, but don't let fear paralyze you. The climb to the roof was the most terrifying thing she'd ever done. Ladder, slick with ice and buffeted by wind that seemed determined to tear her loose, swayed and creaked under her weight. Halfway up, she made the mistake of looking down and saw the ground falling away beneath her with sickening clarity. "Don't look down," Jackson called from above her. "Look at where you're going, not where you might fall." Good advice for more than just roof work, she thought, forcing her eyes upward toward the snow-covered peak that was her destination. The roof itself was an alien landscape of white curves and hidden dangers. What had looked like uniform snow cover from the ground revealed itself as a complex terrain of drifts and bare patches, each presenting its own challenges. The snow was deeper than she'd expected in some places. It came up to her waist and heavier than it looked. "Stay close to me," Jackson said, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "Step where I step and don't get ahead of yourself. We're going to work our way down systematically, clearing sections as we go. Take all the time you need." "But Cassidy?" He stood up, moving closer until they were separated by only a few feet of space that seemed to crackle with possibility. "Don't take so much time that you talk yourself out of something that could be exactly what we both need." As she walked back to the bunkhouse through snow that crunched beneath her boots, Cassidy found herself facing a choice that would determine not just her immediate future, but the entire course of her life. Behind her, the cook shack glowed with warm light, and she could still feel the intensity of Jackson's gaze. Ahead lay the familiar comfort of the bunkhouse and the life she'd built as the newest member of the Triple Crown crew. But somewhere between the two was a third option, a future that was both more complex and more promising than anything she'd dared to imagine. The question was whether she had the courage to reach for it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in February. carried by a mail rider who looked half frozen and completely exhausted from his journey through snow-clogged mountain passes. Cookie signed for the delivery and brought the envelope to the breakfast table, where the crew was finishing their morning meal before heading out to check on cattle that had been confined to the lower pastures by another late-season storm. "Miss Hayes," Cookie said, his gruff voice carrying an unusual note of formality. "This one's for you." Cassidy looked up from her coffee, surprised. In the 4 months she'd been at the Triple Crown, she'd received exactly one piece of mail, a brief note from a former employer confirming her character for Jackson's records. She couldn't imagine who would be writing to her now. The envelope was expensive paper, the kind used by people who had money and wanted others to know it. Her name was written in elegant script that spoke of education and refinement, and the return address made her heart sink into her boots. Hartford, Connecticut. The law offices of Pemberton, Wells, and Associates. "Everything all right?" Tom asked, noting the way the color had drained from her face. "I'm not sure," she said honestly, turning the envelope over in her hands as if she could divine its contents without opening it. Jackson, who'd been studying feed schedules at the far end of the table, looked up with concern. In the weeks since their conversation in the cook shack, their relationship had evolved into something that was part professional partnership and part careful courtship. Nothing had been officially declared, no formal commitments made, but the entire crew understood that something significant was developing between their boss and their newest member. "Bad news?" he asked quietly. "Don't know yet. Could be." She opened the envelope with fingers that trembled slightly, unfolding 3 pages of legal documents, written in the kind of formal language that lawyers use to make simple things sound complicated. But the essential message was clear enough, and it hit her like a physical blow. Her great-uncle Mortimer Hayes, a man she'd met exactly twice in her life, had died 3 months ago in Hartford, leaving behind a considerable estate and no immediate heirs. After an extensive search, the lawyers had located Cassidy as his closest living relative and sole beneficiary. She was now the owner of a 3-story mansion, 2 commercial properties in downtown Hartford, and a trust fund that generated more income in a year than most people saw in a lifetime. In short, she was rich. Not just comfortable, but wealthy in a way that would allow her to live anywhere she wanted, do anything she pleased, without ever having to work another day in her life. "Cassidy?" Jackson's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What is it?" She looked up to find the entire breakfast table watching her with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. These men had become her family over the past months, and she realized that whatever decision she made about this unexpected inheritance would affect all of them. "I've inherited some property back east," she said carefully. "Quite a bit of property, actually." Pete leaned forward with interest. "That good news or bad news? I don't know. I need to think about it." The conversation moved on to other topics. The day's work schedule, the weather forecast, plans for the spring roundup, but Cassidy found herself only half listening. Her mind was reeling with possibilities and complications that she couldn't have imagined. When she'd woken up that morning, the inheritance changed everything. It gave her options she'd never had before, freedom she'd never dreamed of. She could travel anywhere in the world, buy anything she wanted, live the kind of life that most people only read about in books. But it also created a problem she hadn't anticipated. How could she stay at the Triple Crown, working as a ranch hand for wages that were now meaningless to her, when she could buy and sell the entire operation without making a significant dent in her newfound wealth? More importantly, how could she build a relationship with Jackson based on mutual need and shared challenges when the fundamental equality that had made their partnership possible no longer existed? The morning's work passed in a blur of routine, tasks that felt suddenly strange and disconnected from her reality. She checked water tanks that she could now afford to replace with solid gold. She mended fences on land that was worth a fraction of what she now owned. She worked alongside men who were doing honest labor for wages that wouldn't cover her monthly trust fund payments. Everything was the same, and everything was different. "You're quiet today," Jackson observed as they rode back toward the ranch. Buildings after spending the afternoon moving cattle to a pasture with better wind protection. "Just thinking about the letter, among other things." They rode in silence for a while, their horses' hooves crunching through snow that sparkled like diamonds in the late afternoon sunlight. The familiar landscape of the Triple Crown spread. Around them land that Jackson had bought with borrowed money and built into something valuable through years of backbreaking work. "Want to talk about it?" he asked eventually. Cassidy pulled Copper to a halt and turned to face him. In the months they'd worked together, she'd learned to read his expressions, and what she saw now was carefully controlled concern. He sensed that something fundamental had changed, but he was giving her space to explain it in her own way. "Jackson, what do you know about my family?" "Not much. You mentioned your father had a ranch that he lost in the drought. Your mother died when you were young. Beyond that, you've never talked about relatives or connections back east." "That's because I didn't think I had any. My father's family disowned him when he decided to become a rancher instead of following the family tradition of law and finance. I thought they'd all forgotten I existed. Apparently not." "Apparently not." She took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything between them. The letter was from lawyers in Hartford. "My great-uncle died and left me everything. He owned property, investments, enough money to buy half of Montana if I wanted to." Jackson's expression didn't change immediately, but she saw something shift behind his eyes, a calculation, a reassessment, the kind of mental adjustment that came when familiar ground suddenly became unstable. "That's quite a windfall," he said. Carefully, "It's more than a windfall. It's a complete life change. I'm rich, Jackson. Not comfortable, not well off. Rich in a way that makes this conversation awkward and complicated and probably pointless." "Why pointless?" The question surprised her. She'd expected him to congratulate her, or perhaps to withdraw into the kind of polite distance that most people maintained around sudden wealth. She hadn't expected him to challenge her assumption that money changed everything. "Because everything's different now. The reasons I came here, the reasons I stayed, the things that made us." She gestured helplessly between them. "The things that made us work as partners. None of that applies anymore." Jackson dismounted and walked over to a fallen log that had been polished smooth by years of weather. He sat down and looked up at her with the kind of patient attention he gave to complex problems that required careful thinking. "Cassidy, come down here. We need to talk this through properly." She joined him on the log, suddenly aware of how small their conversation seemed against the vastness of the Montana landscape around them. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks catching the last light of the winter sun. And somewhere in the distance, a hawk called out across empty miles. "Tell me something," Jackson said. "When you were working in Devil's Canyon, when you were facing down Goliath and trying to get those cattle home safely, what were you thinking about?" "Not getting killed, mostly. Besides that, what drove you to take that risk? What made it important enough to stake your life on?" Cassidy thought back to that day, remembering the fear and determination that had carried her through the most dangerous hours of her life. "I wanted to prove I belonged here. I wanted to show that I could do the job as well as anyone. And when we were on the roof together, clearing snow in conditions that could have killed us both, what was going through your mind then? That the work needed doing, that the horses needed protection, that we were a team, and teams don't let each other down." Jackson nodded slowly. "Now tell me this, has any of that changed because of a letter from Connecticut?" "Well, no, but no. But either those things matter to you or they don't. Either you're the kind of person who finds meaning in honest work and shared challenges, or you're someone who's just passing time until something better came along." The words stung because they forced her to confront questions she'd been avoiding. Was her commitment to the Triple Crown genuine, or had it just been a convenient refuge while she figured out what to do with her life? "It's not that simple," she said. "The money changes things whether I want it to or not. How can I work for wages when I don't need them? How can I be your partner when I could buy this place 10 times over? Is that what you want to do? Buy my ranch?" "No, of course not. Then why does it matter what you could do? The question is what you want to do." Cassidy stood up and walked a few steps away, her boots crunching in the snow as she tried to organize thoughts that seemed to be flying in every direction. The inheritance had presented her with infinite possibilities, but it had also created a paralysis of choice that she'd never experienced before. "I don't know what I want," she said finally. "This morning I thought I knew exactly where my life was heading. Now I feel like I'm standing at a crossroads with a dozen different paths, and I can't see where any of them lead." "Then maybe you're asking the wrong questions." "What do you mean?" Jackson stood and walked over to join her, close enough that she could see the concern in his eyes, but far enough away to give her space to think. "Instead of asking what you could do with the money, ask yourself what you want your life to look like 5 years from now. 10 years. When you're old and looking back, what do you want to remember? What do you want to have built?" The questions hit deeper than she'd expected. In all her planning and dreaming about the future, she'd focused on survival and security, rather than on the kind of legacy she wanted to leave behind. "I want to matter," she said slowly. "I want to look back and know that I used my life for something meaningful, something that made a difference." "And you think having money prevents that?" "I think having money makes it easier to take the safe path, to choose comfort over challenge, convenience over character." Jackson was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Cassidy, I've known rich people and poor people, and I've learned that money doesn't make someone weak or strong. It just gives them more opportunities to show what they were already. If you're the kind of person who runs from challenges, money will make that easier. If you're the kind of person who rises to meet them, money will give you more ways to do that." "What if I don't know which kind of person I am?" "I think you do know. I think you've been showing everyone around here exactly who you are for months now. The question is whether you trust yourself enough to act on that knowledge." They were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Tom appeared over a ridge, riding hard toward them with the kind of urgency that meant trouble. "Jackson!" he called out while still 50 yards away. "We got problems at the main herd." "Big problems." Jackson and Cassidy were back in their saddles and riding toward the ranch before Tom had finished explaining the situation. A section of fence had failed under the weight of drifted snow, allowing nearly 200 head of cattle to wander into an area where they could be trapped by the next storm. Worse, the weather forecast called for another blizzard to hit within 24 hours, the kind of storm that could bury animals and keep rescuers away until it was too late. As they rode hard across the snow-covered pastures, Cassidy found herself falling back into the familiar rhythms of crisis management. The inheritance, the questions about her future, the complicated feelings about money and purpose, all of it faded into background noise as she focused on the immediate problem of saving lives. This was what she was good at. This was where she belonged. The next 18 hours tested every skill and every ounce of endurance the Triple Crown crew possessed. Working in shifts around the clock, they managed to locate and gather the scattered cattle just as the first winds of the new storm began to howl down from the mountains. Cassidy found herself working alongside Jackson with the kind of wordless coordination that came from shared purpose and mutual trust. When cattle spooked in the darkness, she was there to turn them back. When equipment failed in the bitter cold, her hands were steady, enough to make repairs that kept the operation moving. When exhaustion threatened to overwhelm the crew, her determination helped carry them through the final Crucial hours by the time they herded the last animals into the safety of the sheltered pastures. The storm was raging with full fury. But every animal was accounted for, every life had been saved, and the Triple Crown had once again proven that good people working together could overcome challenges that would defeat individuals. Standing in the barn as snow swirled outside and the crew tended to horses that had given everything they had, Cassidy realized that her questions about the inheritance had been answered, not by thinking, but by doing. She looked around at the men who had become her family, Tom with his steady wisdom, Pete with his cheerful competence, Carlos with his quiet strength, Billy with his eager determination to prove himself. She thought about the animals they'd just saved, the ranch they were all working to build, the life they were creating together in this harsh and beautiful country. Then she looked at Jackson, who was checking Copper's hooves for ice damage with the kind of careful attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. The money in Connecticut represented security and comfort, and all the things that most people spent their lives pursuing. But what she had here was something rarer and more valuable: purpose, partnership, and the knowledge that her life made a difference in the world. When Jackson finished with Copper and looked up to find her watching him, she saw her own certainty reflected in his eyes. "I know what I want to do about the inheritance," she said quietly. "Yeah, I want to put it to work. Invest it in something that matters, something that builds rather than just maintains." "You have something specific in mind?" Cassidy looked around. The barn, at the solid construction that spoke of quality and permanence, at the equipment that was well maintained but could be better, at the horses that were valuable but could be improved through careful breeding programs. "I want to invest in the Triple Crown, make it the best ranch in Montana, build something that will last." Jackson's expression was carefully neutral. "As a business partner?" "As a partner in every sense of the word, if you'll have me." The silence that followed was filled with the sound of wind and snow, and the quiet movements of tired animals settling into rest. When Jackson finally spoke, his voice carried a warmth that melted the last of her uncertainty. "I can't think of anything I'd want more." As the storm raged outside and the lights of the ranch buildings glowed like beacons against the darkness, Cassidy Hayes stood in the barn that had become the center of her world and knew that she was exactly where she belonged. The inheritance would give them the resources to build something extraordinary. But what made it meaningful was the partnership they were choosing to build together, not just between employer and employee, but between two people who had found in each other the missing piece of their lives. Spring arrived at the Triple Crown, like a promise finally kept. Cassidy stood on the porch of the main house, their house now, watching Jackson work with a spirited young stallion in the breaking pen. 6 months had passed since her inheritance changed everything, and the transformation was remarkable. New barns gleamed in the morning sun, additional corrals stretched toward the foothills, and the horse herd had tripled with breeding stock that would produce the finest working animals in Montana. But the real change was the partnership between them, business and personal, built on equal footing and mutual respect. "Morning, Mrs. Murphy," Jackson called out, using the name that still sent warmth through her chest. "Mr. Murphy," she replied, with a smile that held all the contentment of someone who'd finally found home. The wedding had been 3 weeks ago, a simple ceremony in the meadow where she'd first faced down Goliath. Tom served as best man, Cookie prepared a feast, and neighbors came from across the territory to celebrate the union of the woman who'd proven everyone wrong and the man smart enough to recognize her worth. Now they stood as true partners in every sense, co-owners of an expanding empire, married partners building a future together. 2 people who'd found in each other exactly what they'd been searching for without knowing it. "Ready for the spring drive?" Jackson asked, approaching the porch with the easy stride of a man completely at peace with his choices. "Born ready," she replied, checking the position of the sun. "Crew's already saddling up." The years of wandering seemed like someone else's life now. The desperate woman who'd ridden up to this ranch with nothing but hope and determination had been transformed into someone with purpose, prosperity, and most importantly, partnership with a man who saw her true value. Any regrets? He asked quietly, the question he'd posed many times since she'd chosen to invest her inheritance in their shared dream. Only that it took me so long to find this place, she said, taking his hand in hers. The spring roundup began with 200 head of prime cattle moving across grass that sparkled with dew. Cassidy rode alongside Jackson, their horses moving in perfect harmony, their partnership now legendary throughout the territory. Behind them, an expanded crew worked with the precision of people who took pride in their craft. Tom led the flanks with his usual steady competence, while newer hands proved themselves under the watchful eyes of veterans who'd learned to trust the judgment of the woman who'd once been dismissed as a novelty. As they climbed toward the summer pastures, Cassidy reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From desperate drifter to successful ranch owner, from outcast to beloved wife, from proving herself to men who thought she couldn't do the job to running an operation that set the standard for excellence. "Look there," Jackson said, pointing to a golden eagle soaring overhead. She watched the magnificent bird ride the thermals with effortless grace and thought about freedom, not the kind that came from having no responsibilities, but the kind that came from choosing the right ones and sharing them with the right person. The sun climbed higher, the cattle moved steadily toward their destination, and Cassidy Murphy rode into her future knowing she'd found exactly what she'd been searching for, a place where her skills were valued, her contributions recognized, and her heart was home. The woman who'd arrived with nothing but hope had built something lasting with the man who'd been wise enough to see past prejudice to potential. Together, they'd proven that the best partnerships were built not on what people thought you couldn't do, but on what you could accomplish when someone believed in what you could become. And as the Triple Crown cattle spread across mountain pastures that stretched to the horizon, Cassidy knew that some journeys end exactly where they're supposed to, in the arms of the right person, in the work that fulfills you, in the place you choose to call home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.